I'm Doris Whitaker, 68 years old, and I've lived long enough to know when something is meant to keep you close and when it's meant to keep you away. The envelope in my hand was small, white, and tidy, with my name printed neatly across the center. Inside was an invitation to my granddaughter Lily's 9th birthday party. No handwriting, no warm note, no love, or hope you can make it. Just a time, a date, and an address. I set it down on the kitchen table and stared at it like it might reveal more if I waited. By the end of that week, I would find myself standing on my son's porch, holding a gift in my hands and hearing words I never thought I'd hear from my own child. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt someone quietly push you out of a place you once belonged. I was born in a small Pennsylvania town where family ties were expected to be as steady as the seasons. My parents raised me to work hard, speak kindly, and stand by the people you love. That's the life I tried to build with my late husband, Tom. For decades, we lived modestly but comfortably, and I built my career as a nurse at the VA Medical Center in Harrisburg. We didn't have much in the way of extravagance, but our home was warm, and our door was always open for neighbors, friends, and family. When Michael was growing up, I tried to give him both roots and wings. We spent summers fishing at the cabin in the Allegheny foothills, winters baking pies in the kitchen, and countless hours cheering from the sidelines at his school games. When he married Rachel, I welcomed her with the same open arms. At first, she seemed to welcome me too. She even asked for my cinnamon cookie recipe the first Christmas she joined our table. Back then, Lily was just a baby, her cheeks round and pink, her small hand curling around my finger like I was the safest thing in the room. As the years went on, I noticed the warmth cooling. Invitations became less personal phone calls, shorter visits fewer. At first, I told myself it was just the busyness of life, 2 working parents, a growing child, responsibilities pressing in from all sides. But the quiet spaces between us seemed to stretch longer with every passing year. I tried to bridge them, sending small gifts, offering to help, making sure Lily knew I was thinking of her. Sometimes I'd get a polite thank you from Rachel, other times nothing at all. That's why the birthday invitation felt different. It wasn't just brief, it was bare, stripped of every trace of connection. No grandma, no personal note, not even a signature. Just an address on paper, like something meant for an acquaintance rather than a mother or grandmother. I set it on the side table in the hallway, glancing at it each time I passed, wondering if it was meant as a message. By the 4th day, I decided I'd go anyway. I pulled the faded green fairy tale book from the back of my closet, the same one Lily loved to look through before she could read, and baked a fresh batch of cinnamon cookies just like she used to ask for every December. The morning of the party was overcast, the air cool and heavy. I drove through familiar streets past the old gas station where Michael bought his first soda, past the maple tree he used to climb, until I called him down for supper. When I reached their house, it looked just as it always had: white siding, blue shutters, flowers blooming in the front pots. Children's laughter floated from inside, mixing with the sound of balloons shifting in the breeze. I walked up the path, the gift bag in one hand and the cookie tin in the other, ready to knock. The door opened before I could. Michael stood there, his expression steady but unreadable. He stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind him with a quiet click, like sealing something off. Michael didn't open the door wide enough for me to see inside. Instead, he stepped onto the porch, pulling it shut behind him until I heard the latch settle. His eyes flicked briefly to the bag in my left hand and the cookie tin in my right, before returning to my face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, in a measured voice, he said it would be better if I didn't come in. He called it a matter of keeping things comfortable, that Rachel had worked hard to make the day run smoothly, and that the children didn't need any distractions. The words were delivered evenly, like something practiced, and his gaze shifted toward the porch railing, as though the sentence might be written there. I held the gifts a little tighter, the edges of the tin pressing against my palm. "Does Lily know I'm here?" I asked. He didn't answer, only glanced past me toward the street, as if expecting someone else. The faint sounds of laughter carried through the closed door, high voices mixing with the muted thump of music. For a few long seconds, I stayed where I was, the cool air brushing my cheek. Then I extended my arms, offering him the bag and the tin. He took them without hesitation, his fingers brushing mine only for a moment before he reached for the doorknob. The porch boards creaked under my step as I turned back toward the walkway. I didn't rush. Each step felt deliberate, as though moving too quickly might undo the quiet balance holding me in place. Behind me, the door closed with a gentle click, the sound final in a way words couldn't be. I reached my car and sat with my hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the familiar white siding and blue shutters. It was the same house I had visited for years, yet it looked as distant as if I were seeing it from a long way off. The drive home passed in silence. The streets I had known for decades rolled by, but my mind felt suspended, noticing little. When I pulled into my driveway, I didn't take my coat off. I set my keys in the bowl by the door and walked to the kitchen, placing the empty cookie tin on the counter. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I stood there for a long time, the weight of the morning settling in the stillness around me. Later, as the evening light turned orange through the kitchen window, my phone vibrated on the table. The message was from Rachel. She wrote that Michael had explained everything, that she didn't want the day turned into a scene. Her words were brief, formal, and left little room for reply. I placed the phone face down without answering, my eyes fixed on a spot on the wall until the color outside deepened into dusk. The hallway closet door opened with a soft groan when I pulled it toward me. I reached past a row of coats to the low shelf at the back, drawing out an old cedar box. The scent of the wood rose faintly as I set it on the table. Inside were files and envelopes, each neatly labeled tax records, old letters from Tom during his service, and a packet of photographs from years past. Near the bottom lay the deed to the cabin in Walnut Creek. My name was still there, clear on the paper. No transfer, no co-ownership. It had been mine since the day Tom and I signed it together. Michael had spoken of the cabin for years as though it were already his. He had plans for it, ideas for renovations, changes to the deck. Even talk of solar panels that never materialized. I had never told him no, but I had never said yes either. Perhaps he had taken my silence as agreement, letting the years fill in the blanks. I rested my hand over the paper, feeling the faint texture of the embossed seal beneath my fingertips. Memories came back in pieces. The weekend trips when Michael was a boy learning to split kindling under Tom's watchful eye. The cold mornings when frost coated the cabin windows and we lit the fire before breakfast. Even the first visit after Tom's funeral. November air sharp in my lungs, Michael quiet and withdrawn, the urn wrapped in a wool blanket on the mantel. Those walls had held more than just shelter. They carried the shape of our family's life. I closed the box and slid it back toward the center of the table, leaving the deed on top. The paper felt lighter than it should have, considering all it carried. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but for the first time in months, the thought didn't feel like a burden. Outside, the first stars appeared against the darkening sky, faint but steady. The next morning began with a pale blue light filtering through the blinds. I poured coffee and sat at the kitchen window, the deed beside me. My mind wandered back to the earliest days at the cabin, Tom teaching me how to patch a leaky roof, the two of us stacking wood before a storm, the smell of pine heavy in the air. The floors had always creaked, the insulation had never been quite right, but none of that had mattered. It was ours. I finished my coffee and moved to the living room. From a low drawer in the sideboard, I pulled out a box of old photographs. The edges of the prints were worn, colors faded and some sharp in others. I lingered over a picture of Michael on Tom's shoulders holding a fishing pole, both of them grinning. Another showed me on the porch, in an apron flower dusting my hair as I held out a tray of cinnamon rolls. At the very bottom was a Polaroid of Tom and me standing in the snow, his arm around my shoulders. On the back in his handwriting were the words, "Home is wherever we're stubborn enough to keep it." I placed the photo beside the deed on the table. The two together felt like a reminder and a decision, though I wasn't yet certain what shape that decision would take. For now, it was enough to let them sit there in the morning light. It was nearly midday when the knock came at my door. When I opened it, there stood Carol holding a small paper bag from the market. Her hair was tucked under a knit cap, and she greeted me like no time had passed. She stepped inside without hesitation, moving straight to the kitchen. As she unpacked eggs, bread, and a carton of blueberries, she told me she'd heard about Lily's party from a neighbor's daughter. Her eyes searched mine briefly before she asked if they'd let me in. I shook my head once, and she didn't press for details. Carol reached for 2 mugs, pouring coffee for us both before she finally sat down across from me. She nodded toward the deed resting on the table. "Still in your name?" she asked. I slid it toward her and she scanned it quickly. "Good," she said, "but you need to understand, this isn't just about being left out of a birthday party. When people want to cut someone out completely, they don't stop with words. They go after the paper too." Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, the same tone I remembered from our years working together. She told me I should speak with someone who knew the ins and outs of property law, someone who could make sure my rights stayed protected. From her coat pocket, she pulled a business card and set it down beside my coffee cup. The name read, Linda Alvarez, Elder Estate and Property Law. I looked at the card for a long moment. Carol didn't push, just sat quietly, letting the suggestion settle between us. When she did speak again, her words were simple. "You've been quiet for a long time. Maybe it's time they see you're still here." The hum of the refrigerator filled the pause that followed. I didn't reach for the card yet, but I didn't move it away either. It stayed there on the table, a small rectangle of possibility. Carol stayed for a while, long enough for the coffee to cool between us, and for the light through the kitchen window to shift from midday to a softer afternoon shade. She didn't say much more about the party, and I didn't ask her to. Instead, we spoke about small things, neighbors she'd run into, the weather, turning the blueberries she'd bought from the market. But the card she had given me stayed beside my cup the whole time, the edges catching the light whenever I glanced down. When she finally stood to leave, she touched my shoulder lightly and told me to think it over. The sound of the door closing behind her left the house quiet again, except for the low ticking of the wall clock. I carried the card to the living room and set it on the table beside the deed. The two sat together, one representing everything I already held, the other pointing toward what I might still need to protect. That evening, I found myself opening the cedar box again, leafing through the papers as if the answers might be tucked somewhere between them. The deed was exactly as it had been, my name printed clearly at the top, the date from years ago when Tom and I signed it together. I thought about all the times Michael had mentioned the cabin in passing, his voice casual, certain. He spoke as though it were already his, the details of its future laid out in his mind without ever asking me. I remembered the summer he was 35 when he'd first suggested adding a deck. He described where the chairs would go, how the railing would look, even the type of wood he'd use. I had nodded along, neither agreeing nor refusing, and the plans had faded into the background. But in my silence, I had let something grow unchecked, a sense that the cabin was simply waiting for him. The truth was, it had never been promised. It had been a part of my life before his, a place Tom and I had built together, piece by piece. I took the photo of Tom and me from the box and studied it again. The snow behind us looked brighter than I remembered, his arms solid around my shoulders, his handwriting on the back steady and sure. Home is wherever we're stubborn enough to keep it." The words felt different now, heavier but steady, as though they were meant for this moment. I placed the picture back into its envelope and closed the box. The next morning, I sat with my coffee, the quiet broken only by the sound of a car passing on the street outside. My eyes kept drifting to the card from Carol. The name printed in black letters was clear: Linda Alvarez, Elder Estate and Property Law. I didn't know what the conversation would be like or even what I wanted from it, but by mid-morning, I had picked up the phone. Her assistant answered, and before I could second-guess myself, I had an appointment scheduled for the following afternoon. The office was on a narrow street downtown, tucked between a bakery and an old bookstore. When I stepped inside, the space was small but neat, the air faintly scented with coffee. Linda rose from behind her desk to greet me. She was younger than I expected, her handshake firm, her manner straightforward. Carol had already given her a brief outline, but she asked me to tell it in my own words. I spoke about the cabin, about the deed, about the years of unspoken assumptions. She listened without interrupting, her expression focused. When I finished, she reached for a file already open on her desk. Inside was a copy of the deed, and to my surprise, a document she identified as part of a financing proposal for a business venture. Michael's name was there, along with a section listing the cabin as collateral. Linda tapped the page lightly with her pen. "He's representing this property as his," she said, "without your consent." Her voice was calm, but the weight of the statement settled between us. She explained that as the sole title holder, I had full control. But if I didn't act, others might proceed under the belief that his claim was valid. She outlined a step called a notice of claim. It would formally alert any bank's investors or records offices that ownership of the cabin was not in dispute, but was not his to offer as collateral. The action wasn't aggressive, she said, but it was firm. Once filed, it would prevent the property from being used without my permission, and all inquiries could be directed through her office. She slid the prepared forms toward me, along with a pen. I looked at my name printed there, the lines waiting for my signature. My hand didn't shake as I wrote. When I set the pen down, Linda gathered the papers and told me she would file them immediately. She warned that it might prompt calls or messages, but that I didn't need to respond. "Forward anything to me," she said. "Let me handle it." As I stood to leave, she added one more thing. "Actions like this can unsettle people. That's not a reason to avoid them. It's just something to be ready for." By Thursday evening, I had 8 missed calls from Michael and several messages from Rachel. I didn't open them. Instead, I packed a weekend bag and called Carol. The next morning, we drove to Walnut Creek together. The winding road to the cabin was lined with tall pines, the air cooler and carrying the scent of earth and needles. When we reached the driveway, the building stood as it always had, the front steps still sturdy, though the paint on the railing had begun to peel. Inside, sunlight streamed through the curtains, dust motes shifting in the air. I opened the kitchen drawers, straightened the silverware, and checked the cupboards. Carol swept the floors and pulled the curtains fully open. In the back hallway, I found a box of photographs Michael had once packed away. I lifted each frame carefully, a picture of the 3 of us, after sledding another of Michael on Tom's shoulders with a fishing pole, and one of Tom and me by the stone fire pit mugs in hand. I placed the last photo on the mantel above the fireplace. Carol started a fire, and we sat listening to the steady crackle. The warmth spread slowly through the room, carrying with it a sense of something reclaimed. As the afternoon light faded, my phone buzzed on the side table. The message was from Michael. I saw the claim. "You've made your point, but this is going to ruin things for me." I read it once, then set the phone face down without replying. The next morning, we walked the short trail to the ridge where the creek curved through the trees. The bench Tom had built was still there, a little weathered, but solid. We sat for a while, the air cool and the sound of water soft in the distance. Carol poured coffee from a thermos, her voice quiet as she said, "You drew the line." I nodded, watching the sunlight filter through the branches. The morning after our walk to the ridge, the air at the cabin was crisp enough to see my breath. I started a small fire in the hearth and brewed coffee while Carol read by the window. The quiet had a steadiness to it, the kind that comes after something has been settled, even if only for the moment. By mid-morning, I was stacking kindling near the back porch when I heard the gate creak. Footsteps followed lighter and quicker than Carol's. I turned toward the sound and saw Lily standing just inside the gate. Her hair was pulled back into a crooked ponytail, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. She carried a canvas tote bag that looked far too big for her small frame. She didn't speak right away, just met my eyes for a few long seconds before walking toward me. When she reached me, she set the bag down and wrapped her arms around my waist. I dropped the kindling and held her, feeling her small shoulders under my hands. Inside, I made her a cup of tea and set it on the table in front of the sofa. She sat with her knees drawn in, glancing around the room, like she was piecing together an old memory. Her eyes landed on the mantel, and I told her that her grandpa had hung it himself. She nodded, then said quietly, "I saw your picture in a box in the closet. Mommy was going to take it down, but I kept it." She looked down at her hands before adding, "Daddy doesn't talk about you anymore. I didn't know where you went." I listened, letting her take her time. She told me sometimes she thought she saw me on the sidewalk when she looked out her window. "I thought maybe if I waved, you'd wave back," she said. I reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't have to wave," I told her. "I'm still here." The rest of the afternoon, we baked cookies in the kitchen. She remembered the shapes from years ago, especially the crooked star cutter, and smiled when we found it in the drawer. While the cookies baked, we bundled up and walked down to the creek. The water was low this time of year, but it still moved over the rocks with a steady sound. She skipped a pebble across the surface, watching it hop twice before sinking. "It's quieter here," she said. "Nobody talks over me here." I let the quiet stretch between us, the air cool and clean. By the time we returned, Carol had started dinner. Lily set the table without being asked, arranging the forks and spoons with careful precision. The three of us ate together, the fire casting a warm light over the room. Afterward, I called a driver I trusted to take her home. I wrapped a scarf around her neck before she left one I had knitted years ago. At the gate, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm coming back. I want to make the crooked stars myself next time." I watched the car's taillights disappear down the drive until they were gone. The cabin felt different after she left. The warmth wasn't just from the fire, it lingered in the space she had filled for those few hours. That night, I sat by the mantel with the photo she'd brought one of me holding her when she was barely 2. I placed it next to an older picture of Michael at the same age. The resemblance was clear, the same bright eyes, the same smile. But the paths ahead of those smiles had gone in such different directions. The following morning, frost edged the windows, and the trees outside were wrapped in a light mist. I poured coffee and sat on the porch, the air cold against my skin. When I came back inside, I opened my laptop and saw a new email from Rachel. The subject line was just my name. She wrote that Michael's reputation was suffering, that clients were asking questions, and that the situation was putting him under strain. She said she knew I was hurt, but this isn't the way. Her words were polite, almost careful, but they carried a clear request to stop. I read it twice before clicking reply. My response was brief. I wrote, "You chose to erase me. Now I'm drawing myself back in." Then I sent it and closed the laptop. There was nothing more to say. Later that day, I took the deed from the desk drawer. My name was still there in black ink unchanged. I placed it in a folder marked Transfer of Stewardship and set it aside. Carol helped me scan the final papers Linda had prepared. Everything was in order. The decision I'd made was almost ready to be carried out. I walked to the mantel and looked at the photographs Tom and me in the snow, Michael as a boy, Lily with her crooked ponytail. The cabin had been built with hands that cared for it, and it had sheltered years of memories. Soon, it would belong to something more than a single family. The sun dipped lower, sending long shadows across the porch. I stepped outside and followed the path to the gate. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches brushing together with a sound like a low whisper. Tomorrow would bring the final step, and the cabin story would take a new turn. By late morning the next day, the gravel along the driveway crunched under the tires of a silver SUV. From the porch, I watched a man step out dressed in a dark suit and polished shoes that didn't belong on uneven ground. He carried a slim briefcase and glanced only briefly at the trees before walking straight toward the steps. I opened the door before he could knock. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, introducing himself as Matthew Clean. He explained that he represented my son. Carol was in the living room and looked up from her chair but said nothing. I offered him coffee, which he declined. He opened his briefcase, placed a folder on the table, and began speaking in a careful, measured tone. He said Michael and Rachel wanted to resolve the situation without further conflict. They were prepared to make a financial offer in exchange for my agreement to transfer the cabin's title. He spoke of keeping matters private, of preserving family ties, and of avoiding any disruption to Michael's business relationships. Then he slid the folder toward me, its manila edges just touching my side of the table. I didn't open it. Instead, I walked to the mantel and lifted the framed deed that had been resting there. Taking the document from its frame, I carried it back to the table and placed it beside the folder. I pointed to the bottom where my name was printed clearly in black ink. "This is more than property," I told him. "This is memory and promise, and the last thing my husband signed before he passed." Matthew didn't interrupt, but his eyes held steady on mine. When I was finished, he closed the folder, returned it to his briefcase, and stood. "If you change your mind," he said, "we're open to further conversation." On the porch, before stepping down, he added, "This is already affecting your son's investors." I let the words settle, then replied, "Everyone lives with the consequences of what they erase." He gave a brief nod before walking back to his car. Inside, Carol exhaled softly. We sat together for a while, the sound of the fire filling the room. The folder remained on the table where he had left it. Later that night, I fed it to the flames one page at a time, watching each line of print curl into ash. The next day, the wind moved steadily through the pines behind the cabin. I was on the back porch, stacking kindling again, when the gate opened. At first I thought it might be Carol returning from a walk. But the footsteps were lighter, quicker. Lily appeared, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She didn't say a word before stepping forward to hug me, and I set the kindling aside to hold her. We went inside, and I poured her a cup of tea to warm her hands. She glanced around, her eyes resting on the mantel. "Grandpa put that up?" she asked, and I nodded. Then she told me she had found my picture in a box at home, that her mother had planned to put it away, but she had taken it first. She said her father didn't talk about me anymore, and she hadn't known where I had gone. Her voice was quiet, her words careful. She told me sometimes she thought she saw me from her window and wondered if I'd wave back. I brushed a loose strand of hair from her face and said, "You don't need to wave. I'm still here." That afternoon, we baked cookies in the kitchen. She remembered the cutters from years ago, especially the crooked star, and laughed when we found it in the drawer. Later, we walked to the creek. The water moved slowly over the stones, and she skipped a pebble that landed just shy of the far bank. "It's quieter here," she said. "Nobody talks over me here." When we returned, Carol had started dinner. Lily set the table with careful precision, and the three of us ate together, the warmth from the fire wrapping the room in soft light. Afterward, I called a driver I trusted to take her home. I wrapped a scarf around her neck before she left one I had knitted years ago. At the gate, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm coming back. I want to make the crooked stars myself next time." After she left, I sat by the mantel and placed her photo, me holding her when she was barely 2, beside one of Michael, at the same age. The resemblance was clear. The fire burned low, but the warmth lingered in the air long after. The following morning, frost clung to the window panes and mist hovered over the trees. I poured coffee and sat at the desk. My laptop showed a new email from Rachel. The subject line was my name. She wrote that Michael's reputation was suffering, that clients were asking questions, and that the stress was becoming too much. She asked me to stop before it damaged everything. I read it twice before replying with a single line. "You chose to erase me. Now I'm drawing myself back in." I sent it, closed the laptop, and reached for the folder marked Transfer of Stewardship. Inside were the final papers Linda had prepared. Carol helped me scan them to send back to her. Everything was ready. I stood at the mantel one last time, looking at the photos, Tom and me in the snow, Michael with his fishing pole, Lily's crooked ponytail. The cabin had been built to hold more than walls and furniture. Soon it would carry something new. The sun edged higher, sending long beams across the porch floor. I stepped outside, following the path to the gate. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Tomorrow would bring the last step, and with it, a new chapter for the cabin. The morning of the signing, the sun came up pale over Walnut Creek, casting a thin gold light through the cabin's front windows. I moved quietly through the rooms, checking small things, straightening a chair, dusting the mantel, adjusting the curtains so they hung just right. The folder with the final papers sat on the desk, its edges lined up neatly with the wood grain. Carol arrived just after 8, her arms full of fresh pastries and a thermos of coffee. She set them down and gave me a quick nod, the kind that said everything was on track. By 10 o'clock, a dark sedan pulled into the drive. A woman stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. She introduced herself as a representative from the nonprofit. Her handshake was firm, her voice even. We sat at the kitchen table, and she opened the folder to review the documents Linda had prepared. Carol poured coffee for us all, the steam rising between us. Each page was turned carefully, the sound of the paper crisp in the still air. When it was time, I picked up the pen. My hand felt steady as I signed one line after another until the work was done. The representative explained the next steps. The cabin would be prepared for its new purpose, serving as a retreat space for widows, women healing from loss, and those seeking quiet. She listened as I described the cabin's history, the winters spent with the fire going, the summers when the creek ran high, the afternoons filled with the smell of baking. She promised they would preserve that feeling. When she left, I walked her to the car and watched it disappear down the gravel road. That afternoon, a local news crew arrived. Their van parked just beyond the gate, and 2 people carried equipment up the path. One of them asked if I'd be willing to stand for a photograph in front of the hearth. I hesitated, then agreed. I stood with my back straight, one hand resting lightly on the mantel. Above me hung the photo Lily had returned, its frame slightly chipped, but holding its place. The camera clicked softly, the flash bouncing off the stone. When they were finished, I stepped outside to the edge of the property. The air was cooler there, the breeze moving through the tops of the pines. I followed the path to the bench by the creek and sat, letting the sound of the water settle around me. Carol joined me after a few minutes, handing me a cup from the thermos. Neither of us spoke for a while. The light shifted as clouds passed overhead, and somewhere far off, a bird called. Later, volunteers began arriving carrying boxes from their cars. Some brought cushions and bedding, others unloaded cookware and tools. I stood near the porch and watched them work. There was a quiet rhythm to it, doors opening and closing, the low murmur of voices, the scrape of a box sliding across the floor inside. It was different from the times I had prepared the cabin for family visits, but there was a familiar care in the way they moved. By late afternoon, the work paused. One of the volunteers, a younger woman with hair pulled back in a braid, stepped outside and told me they'd finished setting up the common room. She asked if I'd like to see it. Inside, the furniture had been arranged to face the hearth. The chairs were simple but comfortable, and a soft rug covered the worn wood floor. On the mantel, the photographs remained their edges catching the firelight from the kindling Carol had started earlier. I stayed in the room for a while, letting my eyes take in the details. The air held a faint scent of fresh wood and coffee. Outside the window, the sky was turning a deeper shade, the light fading into evening. I stepped back onto the porch just as the first stars began to appear. Carol joined me, leaning against the railing. "It suits the place," she said, her voice low. I nodded, my hands resting on the cool wood. The quiet between us felt settled, like a chapter closing without being rushed. Tomorrow the volunteers would return to finish the last details, and soon after the first guests would arrive. I glanced toward the gate, the shadows stretching long across the path. Somewhere down the road, life for Michael and Rachel was continuing, the distance between us holding firm. Here at the cabin, something different was beginning to take shape. I didn't know yet how it would all feel when the first women arrived, but the air already carried a sense of something new. By the following week, the cabin felt almost ready for the women it would welcome. The common room smelled faintly of pine, and the new wool blankets the volunteers had brought. Carol and I worked side by side, arranging chairs near the hearth and making sure every drawer and cupboard was in order. Outside, the last of the autumn leaves clung to the branches, their colors muted but holding on. Late in the afternoon, I stepped onto the porch to watch the light fade. That was when I saw a familiar car turn onto the drive. Michael's truck came to a stop a few yards from the steps. He didn't get out right away, just sat there for a moment before opening the door. His stride toward the porch was slower than usual, his eyes shifting briefly to the front windows before settling on me. "I heard what you did," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough for the words to land between us. I waited, leaning lightly on the railing. "You've made things complicated for me," he went on, "but I guess you don't care about that now." He stood there, his hands in his jacket pockets, as if weighing whether to say more. I told him the cabin was no longer mine to give him, and it wasn't mine to take back either. It had a new purpose now. For a moment, something in his expression shifted, surprise maybe, but it faded quickly. "Lily mentioned she came here," he said. I nodded. He didn't ask what we talked about, and I didn't offer. Carol came to the door, then her presence quiet but steady. Michael glanced at her before stepping back. "I just wanted to see it before whatever you've planned starts happening here," he said. I told him he was welcome to walk the property, and then I stepped aside. He took a slow turn around the yard, pausing at the bench by the creek before coming back to the truck. When he left, the air felt heavier, though nothing had been raised or resolved. Carol closed the door and returned to the kitchen, where the scent of fresh coffee was still hanging in the air. We finished our work for the day without saying much. 2 mornings later, the nonprofit sent a final note confirming the first group's arrival date. They thanked me again for entrusting them with the cabin and included a short list of what they would bring with them: gardening tools, journals, and supplies for the kitchen. I printed the email and placed it in the folder with the signed transfer papers. That afternoon, I walked the trail to the ridge. The creek below was running a little higher after the recent rain, its surface catching the pale light. I sat on the bench and listened to the steady rush of water. Somewhere behind me, I heard the faint sound of a vehicle pulling up, but it was gone by the time I made my way back to the cabin. On the porch, I found a small brown package leaning against the door. There was no return address, only my name written in neat block letters. Inside was the Crooked Star cookie cutter, the same one Lily and I had used just weeks before. Taped to it was a scrap of paper with 4 words in handwriting I recognized instantly. "Save this for me." I set the cutter on the mantel beside the photos and stood there for a while, the firelight catching on its worn edges. Outside, the wind picked up through the trees, carrying with it the first hint of winter. The cabin was almost ready, and so was I. By the end of the week, the first guests arrived, 2 women about my age and a younger volunteer who carried their bags with quiet care. Carol met them at the porch with fresh coffee, and I walked them through the common room, showing the hearth and the chairs turned toward the fire. When the nonprofit coordinator thanked me and said they had it from here, I stepped back to the doorway and let the room fill without me. The cabin didn't feel smaller. It felt fuller, as if it had finally settled into its purpose. Linda Alvarez called that afternoon to confirm every filing had posted and the transfer showed on the county record. Her tone was steady, almost gentle at the end. "You're all set, Mrs. Whitaker." I stood at the old cedar desk and ran a hand along the wood Tom had planned by hand. Outside, voices rose and fell as the women unpacked groceries and found the right cupboards. Nothing about it felt like an ending. It felt like a beginning I could trust. Near dusk, a familiar truck turned at the gate and idled by the fence. Michael sat behind the wheel for a few seconds before climbing out. He didn't come up the steps, just opened the back door so Lily could hop down with a small tote bag. "I'll be right here," he said, looking past me toward the windows. No promises, no explanations, just that simple line. I nodded, and Lily slipped her hand into mine, like she used to when she was little. Inside, we washed up and found the tin I'd set aside on the mantel, Lily's stars, written on a strip of tape across the lid. The crooked star cutter she'd mailed sat on top its edge, a little nicked from years of use. We measured flour-cracked eggs and worked the dough until it held together. She pressed the cutter into the soft surface and lifted a perfect lopsided star. "Save the first one," she said, "for the mantel." So we did the very first cookie on a small plate beside Tom's photo, the sugar glittering in the firelight. While the sheets baked, we stepped to the porch. Michael stood by the truck with his hands in his pockets, watching the pines move in the wind. "She can help here if it's allowed," he said, eyes on the trees. "I heard they take volunteers. I told him we'd follow the rules and ask the coordinator. We'd make sure it was done right." He nodded once. "I heard about the story on the local news," he added quietly. "You looked at home." He didn't say more, and I didn't reach for more. Some bridges start with a plank and a nail, nothing fancy. When the last pan came out, the common room was warm and sweet. Carol carried a plate to the women who had settled with journals near the fire. One of them touched Lily's arm and said the stars were perfect. Lily glanced up at me, as if to check, then smiled when I smiled back. We packed a small tin for her to take and left the rest in the kitchen with a note that said, "For everyone." At the gate, Michael opened the truck door and thanked me in a voice I hadn't heard in years. "We'll bring her again," he said, not as a question, but as a plan. Lily hugged me hard, then tucked the tin into her lap and held the crooked cutter like a keepsake. The truck rolled down the gravel taillights, dipping between the trees, and the night closed soft around the cabin. I stood on the porch a moment longer, listening to the creak and the faint murmur of voices inside. Justice didn't come like a hammer. It came like a door I chose not to stand outside of anymore. Dignity was simpler than I remembered. Say the truth sign, your name. Hold your ground and keep a place at the table for kindness when it finally knocks. The cabin is not mine now, and somehow it is more mine than ever because it holds the best of what I had and gives it forward to women who need a quiet room and a steady fire. If you've been pushed to the edges of your own life, I hope you find a way back to the center with something that still has your name on it, your time, your peace, your voice. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who might need the reminder and tell me where you're listening from. I'm right here, and I'm listening too.